Thanks again for joining us this evening. Tonight is our second wine and equine from home webinar, and tonight we're going to be listening to presentations by our our team members from our Rutgers Cooperative Extension Animal Ag and Field and Forage Working Group. So the first presentation this evening is from the agriculture agent in Burlington County, Bill Bamka, and he's going to be talking about weed identification and management. And then after Bill's presentation, we'll have Dr. Mike Westendorf talk about nutrient and manure management on pasture, and he's the Rutgers Cooperative Extension animal extension specialist on campus. And then our third presenter is from USDA NRCS, and it's Caitlin Fabrotnik, and she's going to be talking about environmental quality incentive programs on New Jersey farms. So thanks again for participating with us. This session will be recorded as well as the one from last night, and they will be posted on the Rutgers Equine Science website, like our last series of pasture management webinars. So if you're new tonight and weren't with us last month on our pasture management series, those are up now on the Equine Science YouTube channel, and you can take a look at those past presentations. So I'm going to stop sharing.
And I like to share.
Yes, let's find Bill.
All right, here we go. Good evening, everybody. I've got the job of talking about weed management today. I know we were going to talk about weed management and identification. I'm going to give you some of the tools for identification, but it's really not really effective for me to flash a bunch of pictures of weeds up there. It'd be more effective if I teach you how to manage the weeds. So with that, let's get going. All right. If you're out there looking at this is a healthy pasture. This is actually a pasture that I dealt with in South Jersey. When you're looking at it from a distance, it actually looks pretty good. On closer, you'll see this. The majority of the pasture is actually a false dandelion, also part of the cat's ear. And if you're familiar with this, it causes string halt, where you get the muscles are paralyzed a little in the back leg. I was working with New Bolton Center. I got called on this one. Nobody could figure out what was happening to with the horse, and it turned out to be a weed. So sometimes things aren't what you see. And the other thing I like to point out is get out there and walk your pastures. Is really important to see what's going on. This is the typical healthy pasture, right? Weed free. This is what we're all looking for. That's why we're attending these. Actually, with this pasture, it was actively grazed. It took a lot of work and a lot of management. And that's the one thing is to get these good pastures, there's a lot involved. It's not just, they don't just happen overnight. And here's a question I like to throw out to people. Believe it or not, this is a number of years ago on campus. We're taking a soil sample here. And the question I often ask is this actually weed control? And the answer is yes. This is actually one of the tools that you have in weed management. You're trying to make sure that your pasture grasses are healthy, that they have everything they need. Now, if you're the type of person who, you don't fertilize, you don't lime, you're actually starting on the road to having problems with weeds. And here's something I like to point out to people. I call this the Pasture Triangle. And my point in showing you this is that there's a lot of things involved in keeping the weeds, your pastures weed free. Number one, we've had a couple of talks already about species selection. You got to make sure you're putting the right or the appropriate species within your pasture. You have to look at your site conditions. And by that, I mean, what are the soil conditions? What's the drainage? And the third part of that triangle is your management. And when I'm talking about your management, are you taking soil samples? Are you fertilizing? Are you managing your grazing? These all come into play. because these will actually put stress on your pasture. And when your pasture is under stress or the forage grasses are under stress, that's where the opportunity for the weeds to come in are. We talk about weed control. Kind of want to lay down the groundwork a little bit that we're not just talking solely, about using spraying. There's a lot of different things that you can do. There's preventative measures, buying good quality seed when you're doing your seeding, cultural practices. Are you dragging the manure? Are you there's a whole host of other things, biological controls. There's mechanical controls. By mechanical, I mean, are you actually clipping and mowing? That's one of the big things. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And there's herbicides. My point here to show you is there's just not one tool for weed management. It's a multi-pronged approach, and it really comes down to management. This is a common question or a common thing we deal with a lot. How do you get poor pastures? Probably the number one problem that I see is overgrazing. And with that, we can also put probably stocking density. If you're overgrazing, you're stressing the grasses, which is going to lead, we'll talk about a little bit, into weeds starting to come in. Undergrazing can cause some problems. Poor soil fertility is another big one. If you're not putting lime and fertilizer out there, basically you're not feeding the forage grasses. So if you're not feeding the forage grasses, they're not going to do well, and we have weeds that will start to come in. We're talking about overpopulation, basically too many horses, the wrong species I have listed. You're not doing any clipping or any weed control at all. And if you just plant and walk away from your pasture, you can almost guarantee that you're going to have some problems with weeds eventually in that pasture. So the question you might want to ask, if you're actually one of the people out there now who's dealing with a weedy pasture, why didn't my pasture do well? Well, a lot of times it could be, and probably one of the more common things is poor soil fertility. You got to ask yourself, when was the last time that you limed? When we talk about liming programs, there's a reason for that, because there's actually a soil pH which is the best for producing forage grasses. Are you overgrazing? Did you pick the wrong forage mix for your soil conditions? If you don't address these things when you're doing your renovation or you're managing your pasture, you're eventually going to have problems with weeds. Okay. Here's another pasture that we have. And if you look at this, what do you say? Is this the desirable pasture that you're looking for? And I know the answer is probably not. You can see the weeds are starting to come up. We can see the foot traffic in the area. We can see where grasses outside of the rejection areas are very small. They're probably overgrazed. There's a lot of issues going on here. But that's one of the problems. If there's not a lot of active hands-on management, or if you're overstocked, you can run into these issues. And another one I love to show, and sometimes I wonder what side of the fence the horse should be on this one. You can see there's some problems here. And it comes into the management, as you can see. And the other thing, if you look real closely, which I'll point out, you see the birds that are sitting there in the fence? They can actually cause some of your problems. They'll disperse weed seed, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. This is actually a soil test, and this is where I think it all starts with your weed control, because we're on the road to good pastures with not a lot of weeds. This is where it's all going to begin. This is probably the number one tool, and a lot of people avoid this tool or they don't know about this tool, but this is where you really got to start. We need to know what your pH is, what your soil fertility levels are, what the potassium level, what the phosphorus levels are in your soils. So that's the starting point if you're trying to get on the road to having a weed-free, healthy pasture. And I like to throw this one in. This is what the investment takes to get a soil test. And I'm going to assume you have a 5-acre pasture here. Right now, the cost of a soil test is $20. We recommend that you sample your pasture once every 3 years. So it comes out to $1.33 per acre per year. Okay, you can't run into a convenience store and get a cup of coffee for $1.33 anymore. So it's a really small investment, and it's something I wouldn't overlook if you're trying to have, productive, healthy pastures. All right, we talked about this last night a little bit. This is Steve talked about this. I actually borrowed this from him. But if you look, what I'm trying to get you to look at here are the roots. And when you actually overgraze or you're not managing correctly, if you notice the root depth, you don't have a lot of roots. So what's that doing? Well, what you're actually forcing is that plant to continue its top growth is borrowing from the carbohydrates that are within the roots. So you start to get the roots start to thin out. When that starts to happen, we have less vigorous grass. Then we have space for the weeds to come in and start to compete. So believe it or not, your grazing management is going to have a big play on whether you have the availability or space for weeds to come in. As I manage your grazing, the most common problem I see with weed management is overgrazing. And again, that comes down into, am I rotating? Do I have the ability to rotate? Maybe I have too high of a stocking density. These are become some things you have to balance, but that's probably between fertility and overgrazing. Those are probably the biggest contributors to weedy pastures or problems in your pastures. Undergrazing, not too often a problem. And you also, when you're managing your grazing, rotational grazing, the rest, the rotation, and the recuperating period are probably the biggest tool you have to try to help eliminate weeds in terms of grazing management. Okay, so I promise you to talk about a little bit about weeds now that we talked about the pastures. So what is a weed? Okay, well, if you think about it, and actually it's an undesirable plant. And one of the examples I often give is if you had a rose bush growing in the middle of your pasture, it's undesirable. That rose may be really appropriate in your garden right in front of the house, but you don't want it in your pasture. So it's an undesirable plant. There's a lot of reasons why we don't like the weeds. They actually compete for nutrients, light, and water. They can host insect and disease pests. There's a whole reason why we don't like to have weeds. And if you're looking for the definition of a weed, this is the official definition. I give you a little bit of the history of the definitions that we had for weeds, but this is a really simple definition. A plant growing where it is not desired. Plain and simple. That is what a weed is. Okay. These are two resources that I would think about getting if you're trying to manage your pastures and you want to be able to identify what weeds you have in your pastures. We talked last night about weeds of the Northeast. The other companion book that I would have on my bookshelf would be Peterson's Guide or something similar to wildflowers. A wildflower guide would be very beneficial when you're trying to identify weeds. And why do I say that? You got to remember that one man's wildflower is another man's weed. Those are two tools that I keep in my truck when I'm going out and doing pasture visits. I can identify the majority of the weeds using those two books. All right. One of the things when we're dealing with weeds and we're trying to manage our pasture, we want to know what we're dealing with. Okay. So you have to start looking as whether you're dealing with a grass or a broadleaf. Real simple. And the reason you want to know whether you're dealing with a grass or a broadleaf, that's really how we're going to start developing our control strategies. And the things that I'll tell you is that getting rid of a undesirable grass within a desirable complex of forage grasses is a very difficult task. We always say removing a grass from a grass is difficult. Removing broadleaves is a little bit simpler, but where it gets complicated is if you're like clover mixed with grass in your pasture, now you have a broadleaf mixed in with your grasses, which actually reduces the options we have if we have to use herbicides. The other thing you want to know when you're dealing with weeds, and this is probably the reason I put this pasture here, is if you can see the buttercup here, it's in bloom and everybody notices it. That's typically when people ask what I should do to control a weed. And knowing the life cycle of the weed is actually more important. By the time you see that weed flowering at this point, you've actually missed the opportunity when you should be trying to control that weed. So we have to anticipate what's out in the field. That's why I tell you to walk out in the field, see what's there, and then we have to choose the correct time in the life cycle of the weed to actually get it under control. When we start talking life cycles of weeds, we have annuals, and an annual basically completes its life in one growing season. But we have two types of annuals. We have summer annuals and we have winter annuals. Now, summer annuals germinate in the spring. They produce their vegetative growth in the spring and summer. They die in the fall. The example everybody usually knows is crabgrass. Winter annuals are actually opposite. They actually germinate in the fall. During the winter period, we get some slow growth and we get a big flush probably in March or so in our area. But that's critical to know when to time the control of the weeds. So we have to try to figure out what we're dealing with. That's why I tell you get a copy of the identification guide. Know what time of year you're going out there, and we can help us making control decisions. Now, there's a type of weed called a biennial. That's 2 seasons. Okay, yellow rocket's a common one that you'll deal with. Sometimes wild carrot. It's over a 2-year course. And as we progress on the life cycles, as they're longer when we're talking about weeds that become more difficult to control. And then we'll deal with the perennials. Okay, these are the ones that are toughest to control. We start dealing with, like dandelion would be a common one. Anything that's a perennial typically has a larger root system and a lot of reserves for it. So the approach to trying to get rid of a perennial is probably going to be a multi-year approach. We might be able to knock it down or reduce it in one season, but it's going to take a couple of years to be able to get that fully under control where we would like it. I'm going to have you play detective when you're trying to look at weeds. Okay, on this one, I'm dealing with broadleaf, but I want to start to look at the shape, the characteristics of the plant you're dealing with when you're trying to identify it. You want to look at that plant a little bit more closely and see if the leaves are opposite on the stem from each other or are they alternate. These are all little keys when we're trying to make the identification of a weed that's actually out in your pasture. This is the one with the grasses. I don't know if anybody knows what these are, but these are the two structures that we deal with on a grass when we're trying to make an identification. And so the next time you're even looking at your hay crop, look at this and see if you can point these. What I'm talking about here, what we call ligules and auricles. Those are probably the two keys for identifying grasses, in addition to seed heads, but a lot of time in the pasture, we don't have the opportunity to have seed heads. Okay, so these are what they call the auricles. And the example we give, there's 3 different types of auricles you can actually have when you're identifying a grass. It's actually what we call clasping, which is almost like it's hugging. And then we'll have a rudimentary, which is somewhat in the middle in between, or the auricle may be actually absent. That's one thing. If you take a hand lens, next time you see a grass or timothy, or even if you're looking at orchard grass, look at the sheath where it comes off on the blade there and see if you can find these structures. And here's what we call the ligule. Some people will refer to it as the collar. You want to see if you have that present in the grass when you're out there, if you're trying to identify a grass, it's weedy grass. You want to see if it's membranous. Sometimes when it's membranous, it's a little bit translucent, it's a little bit lighter or white in color. They can be hairy, small little hairs that are coming up, or you may not see them again. So you can have any combination of ligules and auricles, but knowing that actually helps narrow down significantly the grasses that you're going to be identifying. All right, let's talk a little bit about control when we're talking about weeds. I don't know how many people actually mow and clip, but that's one of the biggest things that you want to do to try to get weeds under control. And the reason for that is I'm getting rid of coarse stemmy grass. I'm getting rid of any seed heads. It's a good management tool to help keep weeds under control. And the reason I say that is this is the rule of thumb we use for the summer annual weeds. 1 year's seed is actually 7 years of weeding. So anything you can do to eliminate that seed source, or what we call the pool of seed, we want to actually try to eliminate that. So when you're mowing, your goal would be not to let that weed go to flowering. And the reason I tell you that, and I'm showing you this, is these are actually some different weed species. And if you look at the number of seeds that they produce per plant, and in the far right column is actually how long they will actually survive those seeds in the soil that's undisturbed. And if you look at ragweed, it's about 3,300 seeds per plant. So the next time you walk your pasture and you see, 10 ragweed across that pasture, you potentially have 33,000 seeds that can germinate for another 39 years. And one of the newer weeds that I'm dealing with is at the bottom. It's called Palmer amaranth. Each plant on average produces about 150,000 seeds. So, and they're only viable though, fortunately, for 5 years. But there's a large, significant source of future weeds by letting them go to seed. Okay, here's a couple of the reasons why you're going to be doing that clipping, as I mentioned before. But just like about grading height, you don't want to clip any lower than about 2 to 3 inches. And the reason for that is you don't want to put those grasses in stress, again, because that will actually weaken the root system and the grasses will start to thin. It will actually give opportunity for weeds to come in. Okay, we're talking about weed control. The best defense, as I've kind of laid out for you, is maintaining a healthy stand of forages. Okay, to control the weed too, you first have to know what weed species is out. And if you're going to use a chemical control, we'll talk about following the label. Now, the reason I put this weed on this picture here is, I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with what that weed is, but that is actually Star of Bethlehem, which can be toxic to certain livestock. And some people will misidentify this one, as wild garlic. This one has a distinctive white stripe down the middle. It has little bulbs with it that sometimes more so in sheep or things like that will deal with it. Here's something too that you want to make sure for trying to control weeds. We want to start looking at whether you're looking at management guides. They actually have recommendations for control. So if you're going to follow some of those things, make sure you file label directions. You want to make sure that you're using the recommended amount. And if you're going to go actually and use a herbicide, use the label amount. Because if you use too less of an amount, or if you use, like it says, a half ounce per acre and you use a quarter ounce, you can actually promote the development of resistant weeds. Also know whether if you're going to use a weed killer, where it's selective or non-selective. A selective one will only kill certain species. A non-selective would be like something like a Roundup, which kills everything. And the big note I have on here, because I run into this a lot, just because a chemical or a herbicide will control weeds in your lawn does not mean that you can use it on your pasture. Okay, there are specific reasons. We actually have to do feeding studies and get things labeled. So don't ever take that weed and feed that's in the shed that you use in the front yard and throw it across your pasture. That's a no-no. Real quick, I thought I'd talk a little about poison plants, because it goes hand in hand with the weeds. And again, just like with other weeds, a poisonous plant is just a weed. A well-managed pasture is actually the best way of combating those. A lot of people have a widespread belief that instinct will provide protection, but sometimes not. Okay. The other thing you should know is that typically during periods of drought, weeds tend to be a little bit more lush, and that's when you'll start to get a horse or somebody start to go out there and investigate a little bit. So during periods of drought, make sure you're providing extra feed. And here's the laws we talk about poisoning. John Mead used to be one of our weed scientists. This is what he always said when you're worried about poisonous plants. You take the degree of danger as the prevalence, how much of it's out there, the toxicity of the weed, and how desirable it is as a forage. And you have to look at these factors to see how much of a risk it is. Overall, the threat, when we typically see the problems on more marginal operations, maybe somebody who's new, who hasn't really managed pastures before, as I said before, drought conditions, or if you have that horse that's actually curious, and likes to investigate things. Poisoning, sometimes they can be difficult to diagnose. There's a lot of different symptoms for them, depending on whether we're talking about glycosides, we're talking about alkaloids. Sometimes you need single contacts, sometimes multiple contacts to deal with them. There's actually chemicals in the plant, as I mentioned before, either glycosides, there could be alkaloids that can cause the actual poisoning. I know I'm running short on time. These are some of the plants that are actually common in New Jersey that we have that can actually cause some concern. You look at the trees, wild cherry, red maple. A lot of times I tell people, be careful what's hanging over that pasture. You got to make sure that you're aware of what trees can actually cause problems. These are some of the more common herbaceous plants that can actually cause problems. We actually have a fact sheet which discusses which are some of the plants of concern in New Jersey. So how am I going to avoid poisonous plants? Just like you're going to manage your weeds, you're going to inspect the area. You want to remove the plants. You want to mow. Again, you don't want seed from a poisonous plant actually within your pasture. So managing your pastures, I think we say, would be the takeaway message. Again, don't forget outside the fences. Those areas too can cause some problems. Birds can actually deposit seeds. Here's on campus where we're maintaining the area around the fences to help for the encroachment of weeds. And I thought I'd real quickly just show you a couple of weeds that can be problematic. This one's actually black nightshade. It's in the tomato and potato family. If you're establishing a pasture, maybe in an old soybean field, you may run into it. But that berry that's actually on there is very desirable to birds, and they can actually distribute them along the fence line. And here's a close-up of it. Yeah, like I said, it's in the tomato and potato family, but you definitely don't want this. I've had a couple of horses in Burlington County where I'm based that have had liver problems and actually passed because of dealing with black nightshade. The algae. If you have algae in your ponds, that can actually be a problem. Though not a plant, it's another one of those poisonous issues we have to deal with. Jimson weed's another one that we'll run into. This one will actually kind of crack open. It's toxic. If you ever heard of Jamestown weed, this is where it's from. Kids years ago were smoking this one. It was actually a problematic weed. Again, I know it's close on time. I guess I can open it up for questions and turn it back over to you, Hank.
Bill, I got one question. Do you have, are there any recommended weed ID apps that you would suggest?
There are a few apps that I know you can take pictures of. I think Virginia Tech actually has one. Some of the problems with the apps that I've tested, they sometimes misidentify. They kind of need enough samples to be able to get to a point where they're accurate. It's actually those things that you learn with experience. The more experience you have, one of the best apps actually is your county agricultural agent. That's why we're there. You can actually drop the sample off at the office. I've actually had people bring boxes of weeds to me to look at.
Hank, you ready?
Yep. Do you have, I gave you privileges.
Okay.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bill. I'm going to speak with you a little bit this afternoon about, or this evening, excuse me, about manure and nutrient management on pasture. Now, some of the things that Bill talked about this evening, and certainly what Steve talked about last night as well, about good pasture management. If you want to be able to appropriately manage manure on pasture, whether it's as excreted by animals or whether it's spread on the land, you're going to have to start out with fundamentals of good pasture management. If you're not managing your pastures appropriately to begin with, then spreading manure on the land or just dealing with the deposited manure is just going to make things worse. I like to get in mind this idea of recycling, that when animals deposit manure on pasture, they're actually recycling. The excreted nutrients they have are taken up by plants to produce forage, grasses for the animals to consume. When done correctly, recycling can optimize forage production and availability, minimize use of purchased fertilizers, and can help maintain environmental quality. But when done incorrectly, pastures are going to take up fewer nutrients, and I'm going to show you some pictures of good and poor pastures for taking up manure nutrients in a moment when spread or deposited. Pastures that not managed correctly will be a greater risk of polluting runoff, greater erosion risks, and just overall lower quality pastures. Now, I'd like us to start by thinking a bit about what comes on and goes off the farm. And some of you have probably seen a slide like this before, that our farms within the middle of the box. And coming on the farm, we have inputs and we have outputs going off the farm. Inputs are things like feed, animals, water, fertilizer, legume nitrogen coming onto the farm. In this case, a horse farm. And then we have outputs on the same farm: meat, milk, crops, manure. We want our farm to be as much in balance as we can. So what comes on the farm, we want to be in some way be balanced by what goes off the farm. Practically speaking, and we look at that here, we do have nutrients coming on the farm. We have those going off the farm, but the system's not going to work completely well. Generally, we're going to have nutrients that are lost or go into soil storage. Ideally, what we have though is the feed that we feed the animal produces manure. We use that to fertilize our crops, spread manure on our crops. In this case, grass takes it back up, and the animal, we produce feed for our animal. Well, what are some of the benefits? Talk a little bit about the benefits of properly using manure. Manure maintains soil fertility by increasing organic matter, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It can, when properly used, manure can result in decreased nitrogen leaching potential, can reduce soil erosion and runoff. It will increase soil carbon and organic matter, and that's very important for soil health and soil management. It can increase soil productivity. And when done properly, we can replace energy-intensive nitrogen fertilizer and limited resource phosphorus fertilizer. Organic matter will improve soil quality, help control erosion, and will release slowly available plant nitrogen over time. Manure contains organic carbon, and organic carbon is one of the keys to soil health and structure. In one study that was done, manure reduced total runoff on the fields where it was spread by anywhere from 1% to 68%. So manure will give the soil some structure, and it can be important in reducing total runoff and erosion. Increased nitrogen from manure can promote forage growth if pastures are well vegetated. You see a great example of that in this picture with some beef steers. Those pastures are great looking pastures, been well vegetated. You know, the manure that's going to be produced by those animals is going to provide a good fertilizer, good nutrient source for those animals. A healthy forage stand will help to keep nutrients in the soil. So Bill and Steve talked about the importance of pasture management. When we manage our pastures appropriately, we're going to provide good ground cover, and we're going to be able to keep nutrients in the soil because of the way we manage our pastures, and ultimately we're going to reduce erosion risks and have lower erosion risks and losses. And here another picture of some horses that are grazing a nice lush pasture. Proper management results in the production of healthy, vigorous pastures for grazing. At the same time, overgrazed or poorly managed pastures will not uptake significant amounts of nutrients. And Bill showed some pictures of some pastures that didn't look so great tonight, and Steve did last night. And those are pastures that are not going to properly take up the nutrients we have from manure, whether it's deposited by the animal or whether it's spread on the land. So this is a good example of a place we don't spread manure, and we probably don't want to have animals on it. Overgrazed or poorly managed pastures may cause erosion and runoff risks. This particular pasture, it's in New Jersey. I won't tell you where, but some horses were living on that pasture, and not a lot of good drainage and very, very poor stand of pasture on it. So whenever it rained like this, it was definitely an erosion risk. There's streams to the back of that pasture. And I mentioned this is the same pasture at a different time, I think. Again, the over-application of manure will result in soil nutrient buildup on those overstocked pastures. And I put phosphorus here at the bottom because I think what has been found in the past is that when pastures are over grazed with horses or any animal, phosphorus tends to build up in the soil. And I have maybe Bill can chime in here. I remember when Jeremy Singer did some pasture work years ago. I think he found extremely high levels of phosphorus on soil on horse pastures, maybe in the range of 500 or 600 pounds of phosphorus to the acre. So when we're overstocking and when we're not managing pastures properly, we're going to have a big buildup in some of our nutrients. And this is a water pollution risk. Now this certainly is at a time of year when there's a lot of rainfall, and when animals were grazing in that particular pasture, and really it was more of an exercise lot that they wanted to be able to raise animals on, and during the wrong time of the year they had a mess. So, and of course, most of you horse owners know what one of the risks is with this. Not only is it a risk because of the poor pasture and the manure stored in it, but we're going to be concerned about parasites that might be reinfesting our pastures when manure is stored. I'm not going to go into how manure ought to be stored on farms, but this is a way that we should definitely not be storing manure. And manure, when deposited on pastures, again, back to Bill's point about properly maintaining and managing pastures. When they're not maintained or managed, manure that's spread back onto that land, either deposited by the animals or spread, we're going to be respreading weed seeds that are back on the field, and we're going to get a weed patch like we've got here. On the other hand, healthy crops use more nutrients. So if we've got a nice good stand of pasture, it's going to take up nutrients a lot better than poorly managed pastures. Another example of a decently managed pasture here. This was there is some manure that's been spread in the front here, but it's all in all the management's better than a couple of those we looked at. Well, how do we get started on doing properly? I think in our mind we ought to be just thinking about keeping things balanced. So if we think that and for instance, I'm going to say that a well-vegetated and managed pasture will produce 2 to 3 tons of pasture forage for grazing. I think that's probably a decent yield. Some other people might correct me on that, but then we only want those animals to have enough nutrients from what they graze and from what's spread to meet that 2 to 3 tons per acre production. So if we think that's the yield that we're going to get, then we want the combination of the manure we spread, plus any fertilizer we spread, plus whatever's deposited on the pasture to come to that range that we add enough nutrients to produce that 2 to 3 tons per acre. Now, I know that Caitlin is going to follow me in a few minutes here, Caitlin Forbotnik, and the NRCS has a nice little pasture balance calculator that they use, and which kind of does this, a spreadsheet where they'll you know how many animals you've got, and you know the acreage that you have, and will tell whether your pasture is in balance or not. Secondly, if a poor quality pasture produces less than 1 ton per acre, then only small amounts or no manure should be spread. Manure should only be applied to healthy growing pastures. And Steve gave us some guidelines last night on that. If you want to go back and look at his notes when you can, about what constituted a good pasture. If animals are heavily stocked, or if pastures are of poor quality with significant areas where there is poor ground cover, that's less than 70% cover, then manure should not be spread. And I think that level of cover, that's 70% ground cover, minus the bare spots. I think that's the number that the State Department of Agriculture uses in judging the quality of pastures. Finally, manure from stalled horses will often contain bedding. If manure has been heavily bedded with wood products such as shavings or sawdust, don't spread it on pastures to be grazed or cut for hay without composting or aging. Doing so may reduce plant nutrient uptake and slow forage growth. If smaller amounts are used, or if straw is used as bedding, then manure can be spread with caution. When manure has been composted, it can be spread with fewer concerns. And composting is, if we're able to compost manure that we're going to spread, that's a benefit for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk a little later. Where do we spread our manure? And I'm not going to go into details on this, but we're going to look at the geology, streams, lakes, aquifers, water tables, rivers, the slope. We're going to apply manure to sites with the gentlest slopes as possible. We're going to avoid slopes with greater than 10% slope. We'll be aware of our neighbors and odors and nuisance. So which manure goes where? Well, we're going to probably want to apply our manure with the highest nitrogen content in the spring or fall. Apply manure with the lowest nitrogen content in the summer. We're going to haul manure with the highest nutrient content to the farthest fields. Apply manure with the lowest nutrient content to the closest fields. And why would we want to do that? Generally because generally the fields that are closest to the farm or the closest to the barnyard tends to be the area that gets over fertilized. So put the lower amounts of manure, the lower nutrient content manure on those fields, and spread take that's higher nutrient content to further fields. Use caution when applying manure to grazed pastures. There can be a parasite risk. Grazing animals will recycle manure nutrients and reduce the need for subsequent applications. To maintain groundwater quality, limit nitrogen applications on sandy soils, high water tables. And to receive the most value from manure, apply high phosphorus manure to fields with lowest phosphorus levels. I throw this in here to give you a sense of how much manure some of our different animal species produce. And a beef cow will produce about 11.5 tons. That's a mature 1,000-pound cow will produce about 11.5 tons of manure per year. An adult horse, 1,000 pounds again, about 10 tons per year. So you can, if you want to kind of pencil out and figure out how much nutrients your animals are actually producing in your manure pile, you can do that. You know about what they're going to be producing, what each species is going to produce, and then you can determine how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium each of those animals is going to produce, and you can determine how much you might be able to spread on your land. Maybe you want to get a manure test. This is taken from the Dairy One Forage Laboratory in Ithaca, New York. And if you want to get a manure test, that's a laboratory you can go through. And nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the three major things that are tested for. And you can use those numbers if you want to determine how much manure you should spread on your land. And you can use this little guideline, and this may not be the most up-to-date figures. I see this was done by Dr. Joseph Heckman a few years ago, and I've highlighted the area, the hay production area on that. So if you want to get a certain amount of yield, then that's the amount of roughly the amount of either in this case phosphate or potash that you need to be adding. So the point I'm trying to make is that we know how much nutrients our animals will produce, and we know how many nutrients that our plants require, our grasses require for production, and you can balance that. That's something you can work through and balance on your own. Just some tips for success, and I'll work through these fairly quickly. I'm sure we're probably running short on time. Maintain and manage pastures to optimize grass growth. That's the key to properly using manure on pasture. This includes maintaining fertility through regular soil testing and fertilizer and manure applications. So again, as I've said several times and have been said yesterday and today, if you manage your pastures properly, that's kind of ground one, and that'll allow you to better use your manure nutrients. Implement a grazing management plan. Don't overstock your pastures. Make use of sacrifice lots. Have a separated area out that where you keep your animals for shelter or feed or water, apart from the fields where you graze your animals. Make use of a sacrifice lot. Limit animal contact with streams and wetlands through the use of fencing. Designated stream crossings and grass waterways or buffers. Showed you a couple of slides earlier where animals were not being kept out of away from waterways, and those were definite erosion risks. And runoff. Only spread manure to meet plant growth requirements. Don't overspread. Mow pastures to promote new lush growth and to aid in weed control. Bill made a good presentation about that. As you mow your pastures, they're important to maintaining weed control. Drag harrow to break up manure clumps. It'll spread out the nutrients that are present, and it'll help to reduce those parasite risks. Avoid both overstocking and understocking. Don't apply manure to pastures with little ground cover or bare ground. And again, the number I gave you earlier was 70%. Above that is a 70% ground cover. Nutrients will not be used, and erodible soils or rainfall will be environmental risks. Compost manure to be spread. This will reduce both parasite and weed risks. Certainly composting has several benefits, and one is that if we compost and compost properly, we reach the proper composting temperatures, and we turn it several times and allow it to keep composting, we're going to destroy parasites. We're going to destroy weed seeds. So we'll definitely cut back on any parasite and weed risks that we have. And at the same time, if we are using a lot of woody products as bedding, compost is good for to breaking down the wood bedding based manure, which can be again important for proper use on pasture. And finally, if you're concerned, you can treating for parasites is something that if you're concerned about the manure on pasture, certainly treating for parasites is good. I mentioned a sacrifice area. This just gives a little schematic that an area where we have a shelter, a feeding area, water, and animals are going to live in that area, and we're going to turn them out to each pasture and rotate them through all those pastures. That's going to keep any mud buildup or spilled feed, or it's going to keep that kind of behavior out of the pastures, maintain the pasture quality, and use that sacrifice area, that rest or exercise area, but as we rotate through all the pastures. And this is an example of an exercise area where that was done. This particular farm had a very poor system for exercise areas prior to this, and they built a special area to keep their animals in. Again, this is a picture from on campus, but Dr. Williams has done a really nice job of coming up with a rotational grazing plan for our farms, for our horse farm, and if you have the opportunity sometime, you should come and see just how she manages it. But you can see all the fences that are in place here, and just set up for us to be able to rotate animals. Bedding use. Bedding ends up as part of the manure that's collected from animals. Typical materials: sawdust, hay, straw, wood shavings, sand in some cases. Typical use scenarios would be horse stalls and run-in sheds. Remember that when you're adding bedding, you will add about a half to a third to a half of the original dry bedding volume because of the manure. Manure tends to fill in the void spaces. And again, this kind of backs up to what we said about composting. Here's a nice composting example, and where the man has a nice little facility. This, by the way, is an NRCS funded facility, so which is managed very well by this individual. And another facility where they're turning their compost with a turner such as this. Brief review. I'll just not go into details here, but there are a lot of benefits from proper managing the proper use of nutrients on pasture. Soil fertility, proper organic matter use, increased nitrogen on manure, healthy forage stands, proper management produces good pastures. And then just some of the some things we want to be concerned about on our pastures as well, such as proper good quality pastures, not overgrazing them, being concerned about coming up with a situation where we don't have to worry about erosion risks or water pollution risks. And with that, I'm finished. If there are any questions, you can save them for later or put them in the chat box.
Mike, this is Carrie. While you're switching over things, there was one question I saw come through. It says, how many acres per 1,000-pound horse would you need to be able to leave manure down?
I don't know that I quite understand the question. What was that?
It says, how many acres per 1,000-pound horse to be able to leave manure down? Anna, if you want to clarify your question, we can probably get to it.
I can answer her offsite here.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, she's in the chat box, Mike, if you look in the chat.
Okay.
It's all yours, Kayla.
All right, thank you. All right, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay.
And you can turn your camera on too, Caitlin, if you would like.
What was that?
You can turn your camera on. We have presenters usually turn their cameras on if you would like.
Okay. Oh. How's that? All good to go. All right. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the programs that NRCS can offer to folks that are looking to do any of these practices that you've heard about over the last couple of days. And I'll go over just real quickly the approach that NRCS takes. So you heard a lot about nutrient management, forage management, animal management over the last couple of days. And all of that goes into our version of pasture management, which ultimately ends with a grazing plan. And the goal for the grazing plan is that it's a very comprehensive plan that takes in consideration all of these three things. And the ultimate goal is to make the plan easy for the producers, for you guys to use, and for it to be realistic, and for it to be easily adapted to the current conditions that you have at your farm. So part of the process of working with us, it's really an educational process as well. We learn from you and you learn from us, just little things that we found that some folks don't really understand, especially with the utilization rates. You know, you can decrease your forage or your hay inputs by about 15% by decreasing your rotations from 7 days to 5 days. So little things like that, we really try to work with producers so we can optimize the forage that they have available to them. And I'll go over just a little bit nutrient management. I think Mike just covered that really great. But one of the really important things is the pasture yield in nutrient management that we look at. So if you're grazing appropriately, you know, you can really increase your yield. But a lot of it also has to do with your soil conditions. So pine barrens, maybe we'll get like a ton per acre. You saw the chart that Mike just showed. In other areas, we can get 3, 4, 5 tons per acre, depending on how it's managed. So that's something we definitely look at. A lot of it goes into forage type also. Some forages just do not produce as well as other forages. They just don't have the biomass. And also if you have a lot of legumes in your pasture, that's going to influence your nutrient management also. Maybe you don't need to put as much extra manure on or extra fertilizers on because your legumes are doing a good job providing nutrients to the other forages in your pasture. And then one of the things that we look at is days per year on pasture and hours per day on pasture, because that really lets us know how much manure that's being deposited on those pastures. And as mentioned just before, we have a really simple, great, it's called the pasture nutrient balance calculator. You just put in how many animals you have, their weights. It does have average manure values in it, but if you have a manure test, you can customize that. So those are the things we look at for the nutrient management portion. And then for the forage management, we're really looking at your grazing heights. Some forages, you want to put them in 8 to 12 inches. Some forages can tolerate getting put in at a shorter height. And then some forages, really you need to take them off at about 4 inches. Bluegrass can be grazed pretty heavily, so you can probably take that one off at 2 or 3 inches. Obviously, you would want to leave as much grass as you can, but your grazing in and out heights are really important, and that's something that we'll stress in the plan. And then your forage characteristics obviously are important too, and your soil and how they relate to your soil. So can your forages withstand the wetter areas of your pasture, the drier areas of your pasture? If you have a shaded area, you know, what forages do better in the shade. So that's what we look at for forage management. And then obviously it's a grazing plan, we're grazing animals. So we're going to look at an animal management portion of the plan also. And we're really looking at the animal management plan in terms of food, shelter, and water. So how much forage is out there? What do the animals need? What can we supply from those pastures? Then we also do look at the shelter. If your animals are going to be out in really dry, hot times of the year, is there shade for them? Do they need shade? If they're going to be out in the winter time, maybe we need to put in some windbreaks. So we really look at the shelter aspect. And then water, of course, is very important. We want to make sure that you have the right amount of water, that it's clean, healthy water for the animals, and that the water is placed in areas that help promote an even grazing distribution. And from looking at all of those things, we put together this grazing plan, and in the grazing plan, then there are practices that are suggested. And I'll go over some of these practices. They're fundable through the EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. That's where we fund a lot of our livestock projects. We also have the Agricultural Management Assistance Program, and that rotates around the state. So it might be in your area once every 3 years. And then we also have the Conservation Stewardship Program, the CSP program. So there's 3 different funding opportunities, and each of the programs have a different purpose, and you can work with one of our planners and they'll figure out which program would be best for you. So these improved sacrifice areas, we call them HUAPs. Heavy use area protection is what we call it, but sacrifice area, improved area, dry lot, anything like that. And for horse operations, it's generally different layers of stone with a fine stone on top or dust on top. Sometimes there's sand on top. And the goal here would just really be to get that area nice and graded. You don't have any of that pond and water. And along with these areas, we might also look at the buildings around. So if you have a building that's putting water right onto that area, then maybe we would also recommend some gutters and underground outlets to get that clean water to a suitable area. The one thing with these is that if they're not covered, it is important to pick them because after a couple of years they can become muddy. So you still have to have maintenance with them, but it does help with mud a lot when you get them draining the right way and you have the proper materials on them. What we pay for is 60 square feet per 1,000 pounds of animal, which is not the recommended rate by Rutgers for how much area that every horse would need. And so most people build these a lot bigger than what we can provide assistance for, but we can provide assistance for up to 60 square feet. Okay, the next practice or practices that we fund a lot in horse operations are a dry stack or a compost. As was just said, composts are really popular for horse operations because when you're trying to get rid of the manure, sometimes folks don't like it when there's a lot of those like high lignin materials in there. So composting helps break down some of those materials. It helps change the carbon nitrogen ratio so it's a little bit more desirable. You don't have that chunky woody material in there. And then dry stacks are really just a great practice. If you need to put your manure somewhere, it contains it in an area. You'll have a buffer around it, a grass buffer to help treat any runoff from the stack. So it helps make your operation look a little nicer and cleaner, neater, more buttoned up. Now, when we start talking about our pasture practices, probably the most common practice that we get asked about is a fence. And we can do all sorts of fencing. We can do exterior fencing, we can do cross fencing. This bottom picture down here, that's actually a fence from one of the more southern states where they use a lot of barbed wire. We don't really use a lot of barbed wire in New Jersey, especially for horses, but when you have miles and miles to run and you don't have a lot of electric, then barbed wire is an option. So the one caveat with our fence is that we would size the area. So if you've got, say you have like 100 acres, you want to fence the whole thing in, we would size it according to what you need. So we can't just go out and fence everything in. Most often that's not the case. Most often we wish we had more areas to fence in rather than having too much to fence in. And then one other thing about the fence also is that we can't replace any existing fence, which is something that we get tons of requests for. If you have an old fence that's kind of run down, it's not really holding your animals in, we're still not allowed to replace any existing practices. So it would have to be a new fence, or maybe a fence was there a couple of years ago and you took it out. And then we would be able to go in, but we can't replace any fence. And we do have a lot of options for fence in our tech reference, which just basically tells us what we can pay for, or what we can fund, what we can plan. I know high tensile, some horse owners don't like high tensile fence, so we do a lot of board fence or coated wire, different types of fences like that. So we do have a variety of options for horse owners. All right, and then watering systems, also very important, very popular. I have a couple different systems that you typically see. And that tire system, I don't see it too much in New Jersey, but I've worked in some other states and they're pretty popular in other states. And it can be frost-free, typically it's not, but it could be. And then that Rubbermaid tank, very typical. I'm sure we've all seen those tanks. Those are more of a temporary solution. Often there's a hydrant and you hook into the hydrant so you can pull those tanks around. I know at our farm we have about 20 acres of pasture and we have one tank and a couple hoses and we just drag it around. We've got like 4 hydrants. So super versatile, great to move around if you're moving animals a lot. Those Rubbermaid tanks there, and you can get all sorts of different floats for them. So they're just a great option if you're not needing anything that's real weather tight, because once it gets to freezing, you have to watch your hoses. There's so many connections where things can freeze up. So they're great for more spring, summer, fall tanks. And then that one in the lower left-hand corner here, it's a heated water, so it would be all weather. You can use it in the wintertime. It has a pad around it. We can install tanks with or without pads. Obviously, if it's like one of those Rubbermaid tanks, we're probably not going to put a pad because they're very movable. But the gravel pads, just if you're going to use them a lot, it just helps keep the mud down a little bit right around the pad where you know it's going to be used. And then that top picture there, again, most often if they're out and about, then you'll find these tanks or the hydrants at a fence line, and you can't really tell in the picture there, but there is a fence, so depending on what side of the fence the horses are on, they can access the whole area of the pad there, and then they just close the fence out to the other side when they're not in the other side. And then we would want to make sure that whatever water source you have, we can do some things like very limited access to streams if that's your only water source. But typically we like pulling it from wells, or there's nose pumps and things like that we can also use. But the most common ones are these water systems that are hooked up to wells. And then we put that all together, and I'm sure you've seen these photos a couple times now throughout this series. But the management practice, you take all those different practices and you put them together, and then you come up with a grazing plan, and from that grazing plan there's a practice called prescribed grazing, which is basically just your rotational grazing. And there's a couple different examples here. The picture that Mike showed just earlier has more of a central location. The animals come back to it every day or every night, or however you lock them in or out of that area. And then there's more systems where they move completely and there's really no central area. So there's a whole bunch of different systems that we can use. And that would really be your prescribed grazing system is based off of all those other nutrient management, your forage management, your animal management, and then looking at the practices that are prescribed to make that system work. So I just want to talk about some of our program requirements a little bit, because it's great that we can pay for all this stuff or help pay for all this stuff. But I did want to just talk about some caveats that we have. So if you're interested in any of those waste storage or improved ACAs, so those pads, heavy use areas, a compost facility, or a stacking pad, it is a requirement that you get what's called a comprehensive nutrient management plan ahead of time. And those plans, it includes your conservation plan, your grazing plan, it'll include a nutrient management plan, and then it includes an engineering portion also, which actually tells you how big those facilities need to be. And all of that makes up your comprehensive nutrient management plan. NRCS does have assistance, so you don't have to pay out of pocket to get these plans written. They're called conservation activity plans. The code is a CAP 102 for a comprehensive nutrient management plan, and then a nutrient management plan is just a CAP 104, and that is just the nutrient management portion. It doesn't include the conservation plan, it doesn't include the engineering portion, it doesn't include a grazing plan, but we would be running the pasture nutrient balance calculator if you do have a grazing portion to your operation. The one sticky point about getting these CAP plans is that they need to be completed before we can go and implement any of these practices. So you're really looking at more of a two-year process. If you wanted to implement something, say, next spring, you would come into the office anytime between now and, say, August and ask for an application, and you would be signed up for a CAP plan. And then once that CAP plan is complete, you can then sign up and apply to get whatever's in that plan implemented. So it is a little bit of a long process. You don't have to use us to get these comprehensive nutrient management plans and nutrient management plans written. You can hire somebody to write them on your own, and sometimes it does take a little bit quicker just because of our contracting process. And one thing that we find a lot is in that plan, it's going to address any existing manure piles. And that's a little bit of a sticking point sometimes. We've actually had people cancel their implementation contracts because they couldn't find a way to get rid of a huge manure pile that they had stuck in the woods that's been there for about 20 years. So you do have some preparation before you go into these plans. Make sure that if you have any existing manure, it can be removed, not just, spread out more in the woods or something like that. And then one other thing we have to look at is to make sure that anybody that's taken the manure from your operation, if you are exporting, anybody that's taken that manure needs to be documented in the plan. So if you have neighbors that come and just take a wheelbarrow at a time, that's not really proper documentation. We can't really track where that manure goes. And one of the reasons for that is because there are state regulations about if you're importing a certain amount of manure, then you are now under the state regulations. So we want to make sure that we at least tell whoever we're working with, hey, let so-and-so know that they would be, they would fall under these regulations if they're taking this much manure. So, and same thing for nutrient management. Sometimes the nutrient management would also, we would talk about where that manure is going. And then the 590 is actually the practice. That's actually when you do your nutrient management portion of the CNMP, or you implement what was in your nutrient management plan. And after the nutrient balance is run, sometimes it does mean that you would be asked to confine your animals for more amount of time than you currently do, because we can't overload any pasture with too many nutrients. We can't put funds towards a project that's going to potentially create groundwater or surface water problems. So you might have to be a little bit flexible. And that's not a guarantee. That doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. And then keeping records of where your manure is going and how and when your animals go outside, what pastures they're going in. So there is a record keeping part that would be required if you want to install any of those waste storage facilities or improved heavy use areas. Now for the pasture improvement practices that we can help with, getting that grazing plan is the first step. That's the first step. We write them in-house at NRCS, so we can help you write that plan. We'll come out, we'll ask you a million questions, and probably a million more follow-up questions, until we get it right. Most of the time, those plans go back and forth 3 or 4 times before you're happy with them. So it's definitely a very dynamic process, and you'll get pretty close with your planner once you get your plan done. One of the requirements that we have is that in order for it to be considered a pasture, NRCS, we say that it has to be less than 25% canopy. I know some people will like to put their animals in the woods. If it has more than a 25% canopy, that's not considered pasture for us, and it's not eligible for some of those pasture practices like your fence and your waterers. And obviously, it has to be capable of growing forage. And now we do have a tool called the Pasture Condition Score, and that is it's an assessment that happens, and we would come out to your farm and we do it typically one assessment per field, or if you have a couple fields that are the same soil type, same condition, we can group them together. But that pasture condition score, we would take that before we start implementing any practices with you, and then after you implement everything, we would take it again afterwards. And we would need to see an improvement in that score in order for us to pay for your final practice, which would be your prescribed grazing and rotational grazing. And so one other thing that is sometimes a little bit difficult to meet, especially if you have a lot of animals on little acres, is that your pastures have to supply between 35 and 100% of the yearly forage requirements. So 35% during the entire year would really be about 70% during the grazing season. We consider a grazing season about 6 months out of the year. So if you fall under that, then we'll have to figure out something, either lowering animal numbers, which is the last case scenario for us. But maybe if there's additional pasture that we can bring in, we can look at fencing in more pasture. Like I said, we can look at making those rotations a little bit quicker, so your utilization rate goes up, which means that you might get closer to that 35%. So that 35% is a sticking point sometimes. Like I said, if you have a lot of animals on small acres, you might not actually be eligible for our programs because of that number. But it's always worth coming in and talking to us about it, because very rarely do we actually see that somebody's not eligible for that. Normally we can get folks to meet the 35% number. And then we also look, is your plan going to be forage-based or nutrient-based? We pretty much look and say, all right, if we're at a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 animal unit per acre, then we're okay. If we start getting more than 1 animal unit per acre, then we'll start running the pasture nutrient balance sheet to see, is this really going to be a nutrient-based plan versus a forage-based plan? Which one is the most limited? Are you most limited on your turnouts based on the soils and the current nutrients, or are you most limited based on the forages? Most of the time, it ends up being a forage-based plan. The only time I've seen it being a nutrient-based plan is if we're in super high phosphorus soils, more South Jersey, very low production, then it might come out being a nutrient-based plan, and your turnouts do get very limited at that point. But very rarely do we see that, but we do have to look at that, again, just to make sure that we're not going to be contributing to any ground or surface water quality problems. And then the last thing, the overwintering areas, we need to identify them and make sure that they aren't creating a problem. It doesn't mean that you have to put in a waste storage. It doesn't mean you have to have an improved area with the gravel and all that. It just means we have to look at it. Maybe put a buffer around it, maybe talk about grading, maybe look at, do we need gutters around it, just to make sure that wherever those animals are in the wintertime, that we're not getting a huge muddy area that, again, is going to be contributing to some water quality issues. And then, as I said before, prescribed grazing is it would be your final practice. It's kind of like the top off to everything that you've done. It brings everything together, and in order for us to certify that practice, we would look at that pasture condition score and just make sure you meet the threshold for the pasture condition score. So that is a very quick overview of the practices that we can help through our programs. And then I've got questions. If you have questions, I'll answer them.
Questions for all of us, for all the speakers, or put things down in the chat box.
Well, people might be typing, Mike. Good idea to mention that if they have anybody that they know that wasn't able to be on either last night's webinar or
Right.
tonight, that we do have them recorded, and they should be on the Equine Science Center's YouTube page fairly shortly, whenever we can get them edited and up. But the previous 3 webinars were all pasture related as well, and they are up and running. We just got confirmation that they are up on the YouTube site as of today, right, Hank?
Good. A question for Caitlin. Caitlin, when people go about signing up, do they need to just come into one of your offices, or with the situation now, can they do that online, or?
Yeah, I think there is a way to do it online, but you have to have been kind of pre-registered. I would say if somebody is interested in our program, call the office. There's about a person working in the office every day. If we're teleworking, we have all of our telephones sent to either our computers or forwarded to our personal cell phones. So we're still accessible, but you just can't come in and actually talk to us in the office.
Right.
I would start with an email or a phone call.
And what are the deadlines that are coming up, or the timeline?
Well, we are just now starting our 2020 applications, or is starting to rank them, assess them, and so the deadline for 2020 has passed. But last year, we haven't done our deadline for 2021 yet. Last year, it was August was when the EQIP deadline was for 2020 applications. So it is a little bit tricky, because by the time you start thinking you want to do something, you probably already missed the deadline. So I just tell people, when you think you want to do something or you might be interested, call the office right away, because we'll make sure that we can get you in before the next deadline comes. We'll at least let you know when that.
And your field staff are available for visits?
Yeah. All of our field staff, we're still going out in the field. If you need a couple people, we won't be traveling together, but folks are going out on site visits every day. We can still come out. If you have a problem, if you want, us to look at something in your pastures or your barnyard area, we're still available to come out and do all of that stuff. Our offices just aren't open to the public right now.
Right. Carrie, there was a discussion, and Caitlin too, there's a discussion on here about appropriate stocking rate. I guess it depends a lot on the quality of the pastures when you're looking at what stocking rate ought to be. Better quality pastures in the spring and fall are going to do better than,
Depends on their goal for what they want to use the pastures for too. If they want to maintain 70% vegetative cover and use pastures as a sole source of nutrition, then it's going to take a lot of management to get to that 1-to-1 ratio, 1 horse per acre. It's probably going to take 2 to 3 acres per horse. But if they want to do a little more management or a little more rotating, etc., you can probably get away with a little heavier stocking density. It also kind of depends on what they're starting with in terms of how good the pasture looks now. So there's a lot that goes into that. But I don't see any more questions coming in. So, and I think we're starting to lose people.
if you have any last questions, punch them into the chat box. We'll take care of them. And a couple people asked, or one person asked about manure testing. And the best place I know to do it is the Dairy One Forage Lab in Ithaca, New York. It's not the only one, but it's a good one that we've worked with well in the past.
I know we send a lot of samples to Penn State if we're writing nutrient management plans, anybody that writes nutrient management plans. So that's another option. I know extension offices, I'm not sure, Mike, you know, for Penn State, normally we go to the extension office and pick up the sample box, but they're not open right now. Is New York sending out sample boxes for folks that need them, or how do you access those?
Ask Bill. Let Bill answer that one.
Yeah, I've had stuff shipped to me that I've needed. They'll ship you out to you.
Okay.
I think Dairy One or Equi Analytical is still operating. I've gotten stuff back and forth from them, so they are still up and running. So was our soils lab. They just reopened.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw Stephanie was on the call. I saw her name on there.
Yeah, they're working. I've got hit quite a few pasture samples over the last week.
Okay. I have a question for Caitlin. Caitlin, when doing manure testing, is there any point in time where you just say, well, a book value is better than a manure test?
We always say that if well, especially for deposited manure, we always use the book values.
Okay.
We'll never take an actual sample if it's deposited manure. If it's in a stack pad, we do recommend taking a sample, but that's a little iffy too, because if you're, unless you have a stack pad already and you're going to manage the manure the same exact way, then that sample is not going to be accurate. And if somebody's stacking just on the surface of the ground and it's not covered and we pull a sample from there, well, that's going to be a lot different than if it then ends up going in a covered stack. So if it's a newer operation, or if we're changing the management, then, or if they change the type of feed, if we're going to be asking them to, or if they're going to be able to put the horses out a lot longer than they had before and they're not getting as much hay and feed, then we just say a book value would be good, because the sample we would pull wouldn't be accurate.
I know that I've always said for very, very small farms with just a few animals, that a book value is probably as good as anything probably better than anything you can go test for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think are we done, everybody?
I think so.
Yeah, good. Great evening. Great discussion. I thought you all did a great job, and some good questions in the chat box.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're